The chisel slipped, and the edge bit into her palm instead of the stone, but Sarah barely registered the blood welling up through the callus. She had worse cuts from worse days, and the man dying on the floor of the quarry shed was running out of time. She was not supposed to be here. The pack healers had evacuated 20 minutes ago, when the eastern fence broke and the rogue wolves flooded the lower grounds. The warriors were holding the perimeter. She could hear them, the sounds of it carrying through the thin wooden walls like something out of a fever dream, metal and snarling, and the particular crack of bodies hitting stone. Sarah was a stonecutter. That was her designation, her rank, the only thing the Irongate pack had ever permitted her to be. She shaped grave markers. She carved the memorial walls that lined the pack's eastern corridor. She chiseled the names of the dead into rock so fine-grained that the letters held for centuries. She was not a healer. She was not a warrior. She did not belong in this shed with the Alpha Lord of the Ashvale Reaches, bleeding out onto the dirt floor, but the healers had run, and no one else was coming. He lay on his side with one arm braced beneath him, as if he had tried to rise and failed. The wound across his back was not a cut, it was a ruin. Something had torn through the muscle and tissue with the kind of force that was not human. His shirt had been shredded. His skin beneath it was tanned and scarred from older damage, and the new wound sat across all of it like a verdict. His breathing came in short, labored pulls that she could hear clearly in the silence between the sounds of fighting outside. She had her toolkit, the one she always carried, the one she'd grabbed off the work table when the alarm bells started, the way another person might grab their keys or their phone. It was a flat canvas roll, the kind that tied shut with a leather cord, and inside it were her chisels, her whetstones, her compass, her marking stylus, and one thing that did not belong to stone cutting, a vial of bonding compound. She had made it herself, 3 weeks ago, experimenting. It was a mixture of mineral pitch, rendered marrow fat, and the powdered dust of white quartz that she gathered herself from the highest ridgeline of the Ashvale quarry because it was the only place the stone had the right crystalline structure. She'd been testing it as a sealant for hairline fractures in granite. It set hard as bone. It held things together that had no business holding. She had never intended to use it on a person. She uncapped the vial. The smell hit her first, mineral and dense, and something underneath that she couldn't name, like the air inside a cave that had been sealed for 100 years. She pressed the first application into the deepest part of the wound. Her fingers worked by instinct, the same way they worked stone, assessing depth and grain and the path of least resistance. She packed the compound carefully, the way you fill a crack, not rushing, not forcing, following the structure of what was already there. The Alpha Lord made a sound. It was low and entirely inhuman, a vibration more than a vocalization, the kind of sound that bypassed the ears and registered somewhere deeper. And then his eyes opened. She had seen his eyes before, once at a distance, at the pack's quarterly assembly. Every packless stonecutter and craft worker attended, required to, standing in the back rows where the light didn't quite reach. She had looked at him the way you look at something powerful and contained, the way you look at a loaded thing. She had thought then that his eyes were dark. They were not dark. They were the color of iron heated past red, past orange, to the point where metal stops looking like metal and becomes something else. A deep molten amber that seemed to generate its own light. Those eyes fixed on her face with a focus that stopped her breath. She did not stop working. If she stopped, he would die. She could feel that truth the way she felt the quality of stone. Through her hands, through some combination of experience and instinct that she had never been able to explain. The wound was deep. The compound was setting, but the amount of blood he had already lost was not recoverable through sealing alone. Something else was happening. Something she didn't understand yet. And she kept her hands moving because stopping was not a choice. She worked the compound deeper and felt the warmth before she could explain it. Not the warmth of body heat, not the warmth of friction, something else entirely. A heat that moved upward through her fingers like current, like the particular resonance she felt when she pressed her palm to stone that had been in sunlight for many hours, a warmth that had been stored, not generated. It spread through her hands, her wrists, her forearms, and her wolf stirred. She nearly pulled back. Her wolf had not stirred in 4 years, not since the pack assessment at 18, when the Irungate Alpha, a man named Dorvale with no interest in subtlety, had declared her wolf suppressed and assigned her to the craft labor rotation. She'd been told her wolf was dormant, defective, a thing that might occasionally twitch but would never wake. She had accepted it the way you accept a scar. Not with peace exactly, but with the understanding that fighting it changed nothing. But now it moved. Slowly, the way something vast shifts its weight in sleep. She placed more compound, sealed the upper edge of the wound, and with each pass of her fingers, the warmth intensified, and her wolf pressed incrementally closer to the surface, and the Alpha Lord's breathing slowed from labored to something steadier. She was almost finished when the shed door burst open. 2 warriors in pack armor came through at a run. They stopped when they saw her. The larger one said, "What is that craftworker doing to Lord Calder?" The other said, "Get her away from him, now." A hand closed around her upper arm and hauled her backward. The vial pulled free, and the single drop of compound, laced with the residue of her blood from the cut on her palm, fell onto the exposed skin of his shoulder. Where it landed, the compound did not simply sit. It sank, and where it sank, the skin closed around it, and from beneath the surface, a faint amber light pulsed once, twice, and held. The shed went completely quiet. Lord Calder spoke for the first time. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "Let her go." The hand released her. She stumbled, caught herself on the work table, and turned back to find both warriors standing very still, staring at the place on his shoulder where the light had been. Their faces held an expression she'd never seen directed at her before. It took her a moment to identify it, something adjacent to awe. Calder pushed himself upright. He should not have been able to. 30 seconds ago he had been a man bleeding to death on a dirt floor, but he was upright now. One arm braced on the ground, the wound on his back sealed cleanly at the edges, the skin beginning to knit in a way that was faster than any shifter healing she had ever seen described, as if her compound had not just sealed the wound but accelerated something already in him. "Come here," he said. Sarah did not move. She was holding her vial and her spreading knife, and she was suddenly acutely aware of herself. Her workclothes gray with stone dust, her hair tied back unevenly, her hands calloused and stained, her boots worn through at the left heel. She was thin in the way of people who ate what was left after others finished, because craft workers in Irungate were at the bottom of the rotation, always, and there was never quite enough left by the time it reached them. She had a scar along her jaw from the time a granite ship had caught her wrong 3 years ago, and her palms were a map of smaller damage, compressed, healed, grown over, repeated. "Come here," he said again. Quiet. Certain. "The way you speak to a creature you are not trying to frighten." She crossed the shed and crouched beside him, because her legs were shaking and crouching was the only dignified version of almost falling. He took her hand, the one with the fresh cut on the palm. His fingers closed around hers, and the warmth that had been building through her work erupted all at once, a wave that moved from her hand up her arm and broke somewhere behind her sternum with a pressure she did not have words for. Her wolf surged, not the tentative stirring of before, something fuller, something that opened like a door swinging wide into a room full of light. She heard herself make a sound she did not intend. His thumb traced the cut on her palm slowly once. "What's your name?" he said. "Sira." "Sira." He said it back the way you repeat a thing to test whether it is real. "Who cut your hand?" "I did." The chisel slipped. "When?" 15 minutes ago. He looked at the cut. Something moved across his face that she couldn't fully read. "What is that compound you used?" "Mine. I made it for stone repair. It seals fractures." It sealed more than a fracture. The warriors behind her shifted. One of them cleared his throat. "My lord, the northern fence has fallen. We need to move." Calder did not look away from her. He had not looked away from her since he opened his eyes. "Finish what you started first." The warrior stepped closer. There isn't. The look Calder gave him was not a command in words. It was something more fundamental than that. The warrior stopped mid-sentence. Calder turned back to Sarah. There's more compound in the vial? Yes. Finish. She finished. Her hands were steadier than they had any right to be, the bond between them. She was beginning to understand that was what it was, though she did not yet have a name for what kind. Pulsed with each application, a living thing, growing more defined with each pass. She could feel his heartbeat distantly, like hearing music from another building. She could feel something immense behind it, something that was not just a man, not just an alpha, but the wolf beneath the man, and the wolf was looking at her with an attention that was not territorial. That was something older than territory. When the last of the compound was set, she capped the vial. Her hands were trembling now, not from fear. "What did I do?" she said, mostly to herself. "Saved my life," Calder said. "I know that part. I mean the other thing." He looked at her for a long time. The amber in his eyes had deepened to something almost dark. "My wolf calls you, mate," he said. "That's what the other thing is." Sarah sat back on her heels. "That's not possible," she said, because it was not. She was a craft worker, packless in all the ways that mattered, assigned to labor rotation and grave markers and the kind of work that no one else wanted to do. She ate what was left. She slept in the craft worker's block above the stone-cutting yard because the vibration of the equipment below kept the room warm year-round, and it was the only available room that didn't freeze in winter. She was no one. She was the girl who chiseled names onto stones for the important dead, and she had never expected to be anything else. "It's not a question of possibility," Calder said. His eyes had not moved from her face. "It's done." The warriors got him to the inner stronghold on a stretcher, and Sarah followed because he would not release her hand. He held it with a grip that was not forceful exactly, more like gravity. Consistent. Irresistible not through pressure, but through simple fact. The inner stronghold of the Ashvale Reaches was the opposite of the cold utility of the outer grounds. Its walls were fitted stone. Good stone. Sarah noticed automatically. Local granite. The grain running correctly. And it was lit by a series of high windows that caught the angle of the afternoon sun and scattered it across the floor in long gold shapes. Warriors were already gathered inside, some wounded, some tending wounds, all of them turning to watch as their alpha lord was carried in with his hand locked around the fingers of a stone-dusted craftworker who looked like she had not had a full meal in 6 months. She waited for the whispers. She got silence, the kind that fills a room when the person with the most authority in it does something that cannot be explained by any existing rule. A healer, older, broad-shouldered, with gray braids and hands that moved like tools, came forward and stopped when she saw the wound. She leaned in close. "What sealed this?" she asked. "She did," Calder said, "with a compound she made." The healer's eyes moved to Sarah, then back to the wound. She reached out and pressed 2 fingers to the sealed edge, and Sarah watched her expression change from professional assessment to something else. "This isn't just sealed," the healer said slowly. "The tissue has bonded to it. Your body accepted it." She looked at Calder. "That only happens with material from a compatible source." She paused. "A deeply compatible source." "I know," Calder said. The healer looked at Sarah again with an expression that was many things at once: scientific interest, concern, and something that in another context might have been pity. "Child, do you understand what that compound carried into him?" "Minerals," Sarah said. "Pitch, marrow fat, quartz dust." "Your blood," the healer said. "You had a fresh cut. Your blood went into the compound, into the wound, into him." She shook her head. "It bonded you at the material level. Every seal is a connection. Every connection carries your essence." She turned back to Calder. "This is a root bond. Old kind bonding. You do not undo this." Calder's hand found Sarah's again. She had managed to reclaim it during the examination. He reclaimed it back with the quiet patience of someone who had decided this was simply how things were going to be. Good, he said. The healer stared at him. My lord, if she is hurt, you feel it. If she won't be hurt, he said. His voice was mild. The mildness of something that has already made up its mind so thoroughly that argument is not processing as a concept. She will not be hurt. That is not a wish. It is a condition of my continued cooperation with everything else on the agenda. The warriors near the far wall exchanged glances. Nobody said anything, because you did not argue with an Alpha Lord who had just survived a mortal wound and was looking at a grey-dusted craftworker like she was the one solid thing in a world that had decided to become liquid. Sarah wanted to tell him she was nobody. She wanted to explain that she had no business being soul-bonded to an Alpha Lord, that she should go back to the stone-cutting yard and her split chisel and the half-finished grave marker she'd been working on before the bells rang, that she belonged to ordinary invisible life, and it was waiting for her, and it was the only life she knew how to live. But her wolf would not cooperate. It had been dormant for 4 years, and now it was awake, fully, unexpectedly, and it had pressed itself up against the bond and was holding on with the grip of something that has been separated from what it needed for a very long time and will not be separated again. She stayed. The rogue incursion was pushed back by nightfall. The following days reshaped themselves around a new arrangement. Sarah was given a room, a single room, modest, but dry and warm, which put it above the craftworker's block in every material way, and told that she would continue to have access to the stone-cutting yard if she wished. She wished. Working was the only thing that made the rest of it feel manageable. On the second day, Calder found her in the yard at mid-morning. She was at the bench, working a piece of sandstone with her finest chisel, a delicate border pattern that required more patience than force. She heard him before she saw him, not his footsteps, which were as quiet as something half his size, but the bond. The steady pulse of it, growing closer. He stood and watched her work. She was aware of him, the way you are aware of sunlight shifting, something warm and present at the edge of perception. She kept cutting. After a while he came closer and sat down on the low wall beside the bench. "Show me," he said. She looked at him. "Show you what? What you're doing?" She looked back at the sandstone. "It's a border pattern. Running chevron. You cut the outline first, then relieve the interior." "Show me." So she showed him. She talked about the chisel angle in the grain direction and why sandstone required different pressure than granite. She talked about the difference between a surface cut and a depth cut, and how you could tell from the sound of the strike whether you were in the right layer. She talked about reading stone, the way she thought of it, the way every piece had a direction it wanted to go, and the cutter's job was to find that direction and follow it, not to impose a direction from outside. Somewhere in the middle of explaining how to finish an edge so it held detail over time, she realized he wasn't looking at the stone. She stopped. "You come alive when you talk about it," he said. "Your whole face changes." She looked down at the sandstone and pretended to examine the cut. "Sarah, yes. When we return to the reaches proper, when this is settled, you won't be cutting grave markers." She went still. "If you're reassigning me from craft labor, I understand. I can find work outside the—" He put his hand over hers on the bench. It stilled everything. "You won't be cutting grave markers," he said, "because you will be by my side. But if you want to work stone, you will have the best yard in the reaches. Any material you want, equipment, apprentices if you want them. You create, not just repair, not just memorial work. You create." He paused. "I think you've always known the difference. I think you've been making yourself smaller than the work for a long time." Her throat tightened. "I can't be a lord's mate. I'm craftworker ranked. My wolf was assessed as suppressed. Your wolf sealed a mortal wound through mineral compound and crystallized quartz," Calder said. His voice was dry, precise, with something underneath it that she was beginning to recognize as his particular version of humor. "I think Irongate's assessment may have been optimistic." The assessment. She'd thought about it differently since the bond formed. She'd thought about it differently every day. The way Dorvale had declared her wolf suppressed with such certainty, Such brisk efficiency, as if the matter were obvious. As if there were no other explanation for why a wolf would not show up on command in a standardized ceremony designed for wolves nothing like hers. "What if they were right?" she said. "What if I'm still?" "They were wrong," Calder said, not loud, not impatient, just certain in the way of something that has measured the ground and knows exactly where it stands. She felt it through the bond, not just the words but the thing underneath them. Absolute conviction, bedrock-level certainty, the kind that wasn't performed for her benefit but simply was. And something behind her sternum, something that had been braced for a very long time, shifted. The third morning, a visitor arrived. Sarah heard about her before she saw her. The name moved through the stronghold ahead of the woman herself, carried in careful voices, Lady Marsh, Calder's mother's eldest sister. She'd been managing the Reach's political alliances for 30 years. She had strong opinions about the Lord's lunar selection, and had, apparently, been preparing her own granddaughter for the role for some time. Sarah braced herself for cruelty. Open cruelty she knew how to manage. She'd been managing it since she was 14. What she got was worse. Lady Marsh was elegant in the specific way of women who had spent decades using elegance as a tool. Her hair was white silver, dressed precisely. Her coat was charcoal gray wool, fitted without a flaw. She came to the stone-cutting yard in the pretense of curiosity, and walked through it with the measured attention of someone cataloging inventory. She stopped at the bench where Sarah was working. "My nephew tells me you saved his life," she said. "I applied a sealant compound to his wound," Sarah said. "With your bare hands, yes." Lady Marsh considered the sandstone on the bench. Her expression revealed nothing. "My granddaughter Tova trained under the Reach's master healer for 2 years. If she had been present, she would have had access to proper medical supplies, proper training." A pause, calibrated and deliberate. "But I suppose in an emergency, improvisation has its place." The blow was so precisely delivered that Sarah almost admired it. Almost. She had spent 4 years in Irongate, learning to recognize the exact taxonomy of that kind of language. The compliment that diminished, the comparison that never raised its voice. Lady Marsh was a master of the form. Sarah set down her chisel. "I'd like to meet Tova," she said. "I imagine she's very skilled." Lady Marsh's smile thinned by a fraction. "I imagine you would." She stood, smoothing her coat. "Dinner is at 6. The Lord expects your attendance." She looked at Sarah, the full assessment of her, the work clothes, the stone dust, the worn boots. "I've taken the liberty of sending some appropriate attire to your room. We can't have you appearing at the Lord's table as a craft worker." After she left, Sarah stood at the bench for a while. Then she went to find the healer, whose name she had learned was Bodine, and said, "Tell me everything you know about Lady Marsh." Bodine told her, efficiently and without editorializing, which Sarah appreciated. The clothes Marsh had sent were beautiful. They were also, Sarah noticed the moment she lifted them, a full size too large through the shoulders and 2 inches too long in the hem. She stood in the middle of the room and held them up and thought about the specific precision it took to send something that could be mistaken for generosity. She altered them herself. She didn't have a sewing kit. She had a leather punch, her marking stylus, and a coil of fine copper wire she used to make pattern guides for delicate carving work. She improvised. She took the shoulder seams in with copper wire tacked at 3-inch intervals, invisible under the fabric surface layer, and turned the hem with a tuck that sat flat as a bond lime. It was not conventional tailoring. It was structural problem-solving, and she was good at structural problem-solving. She arrived at dinner in dark green wool that fit her exactly, and she watched something shift on Lady Marsh's face across the room. Not surprise. Recognition. The specific recognition of someone who has made a move and found it answered. Calder noticed. He noticed everything about her with a consistency she was still adjusting to, an attention that felt like weather. Present, pervasive, impossible to fully account for. He looked at her from across the table and through the distance, and the candlelight, the bond pulsed, and she felt his attention like a hand pressed flat between her shoulder blades. After dinner, he walked her back through the stronghold. His hand was around hers. At the door of her room, he stopped. The clothes Marsh sent didn't fit, he said. It was not a question. I adjusted them. His jaw tightened. Who sent them? Your aunt was kind to think of it. Sarah. His voice was quiet. The amber in his eyes had gone dark and very still, and she could feel through the bond the precise shape of his anger, not at her, but for her, a distinction that was new to her and kept surprising her every time she encountered it. Who sent them? Lady Marsh. And they didn't fit. They do now. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to her knuckles, and against her skin he said, "Whatever they made you believe you were worth, in this place not one minor thing that touches you is minor to me. Do you understand that?" She didn't entirely, but she was learning. She had begun to dream of stone. Not the stone she knew, not the familiar granite of the quarry ridgeline, not the sandstone on her bench. Different stone entirely. White stone, the color of birch bark or winter light, in a landscape she had never physically visited, tall formations rising from a flat plain, carved by something older than tools, and running between them, like veins in marble, faint luminous lines, copper-colored, moving. In the dream, she stood among the formations with bare feet on cold ground, and the lines of light ran toward her and then through her, and she was not afraid. A voice came from everywhere at once, or from the stone. The difference was unclear. "You are late," the voice said. "We stopped expecting you." "Who's we?" Sarah asked. "The ones before you. The ones the order drove out." She woke with her hands clenched around nothing. The next morning, Bodine came to her room. "You dreamed," Bodine said. Sarah looked at her. "How did you know?" "I can see it." Bodine sat down and folded her hands in her lap. "Your wolf is waking. It has been sealed under for a long time. The bond cracked it open. There may be effects you're not prepared for." "What kind of effects?" "You applied your own blood to an alpha's wound through a mineral compound," Bodine said, "in the old practice. Not current healer tradition. The old practice before the ranking system formalized. There were craftworkers who bonded through their work. Not wolves in the standard sense, something older. The old texts called them stone singers. They could bind through material, through making. That doesn't exist anymore." "No," Bodine said, "because it was destroyed, systematically about 200 years ago, a faction called the Silver Compact. They decided that the ability to bond through craft was too unpredictable, too powerful. An alpha could be bound by a craftworker without ceremony, without pack hierarchy, without consent of the ranking wolves. They eliminated the lineages that carried it." Sarah's hands were cold. "You're telling me." "I'm telling you to be careful." The compact maintained records. They maintained agents. If your bond with Lord Calder becomes public knowledge, and it is becoming public knowledge, someone will notice what it looks like, and someone may come looking. Sarah left the healer's room and went straight to the stone-cutting yard. Because the yard was the one place where her hands stopped shaking, she picked up a chisel and started a new piece, not from a plan but on instinct. And the form that emerged beneath her hands was something she hadn't consciously chosen. The veined formations from her dream, in white sandstone, accurate in detail she couldn't have described from memory alone, because it wasn't from memory. It was from somewhere else. When she finished 4 hours later and set down the chisel, the carved lines were glowing faintly, copper-colored light pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. She covered it with a dropcloth and went to find Calder. He came to her that evening. She told him about the compact and what Bodine had said, and she watched him listen the way she had learned he listened, completely, without interruption, without performing consideration he hadn't actually done. When she finished, the silence was short. "How long has Bodine known about this?" he said. "I don't know. She said she suspected when she examined the wound. She should have told me immediately. She was protecting me," Sarah said. She wasn't sure. Calder was quiet for a moment. Then, there is a faction member in my council. I have suspected for some time. I don't know which one. She stared at him. And you didn't. I had no proof. Now I have more context. He looked at her steadily. You're not afraid. I'm terrified, she said. But fear is information, not instruction. Something shifted in his expression, not surprise. Something quieter than surprise. As if she had said a thing he already believed and had not expected to hear from someone else. He crossed the room in 2 strides and took her face in both hands, and the contact sent the bond roaring between them. All of it, every connection the compound had made, every line of copper light running through the space where she ended and he began. I have spent 9 years ruling this territory and making every decision alone, he said. His voice was even, but his hands were not quite steady. I did not expect a craft worker with a vial of pitch and quartz dust to change that. His thumb traced her jaw. I find that I'm not sorry. He meant it. She felt that through the bond too, the same way she felt everything through it now, not as performed sentiment but as the grain of something real, running true, going all the way down. She didn't say anything. She leaned her forehead against his chest, and he folded his arms around her, and for the first time in 4 years of eating last and sleeping above machinery and carving her life into the smallest shape it could take, without disappearing entirely, she allowed herself to stand still inside something that felt like enough. The council member's name was Farron. He was the 3rd eldest, a beta who had served 2 lords before Calder, and he was identified not through interrogation or intelligence work, but through Sarah. She had resumed working in the yard 3 days after the conversation with Bodine, and Farron came to watch her. Once, then twice. The 3rd time, she recognized the pattern. The way he timed his appearances to moments when Calder was in the inner chamber with his commanders, when she was most likely to be alone. She kept working. She kept her face neutral, and she sent the information down the bond like she sent everything now, not in words, but in impression. The way the stone communicated back to her when the chisel was reading it right. Calder was in the yard within 10 minutes. Farron was not subtle about leaving. He was even less subtle, 2 days later, about the man he sent. The figure came at mid-morning, through the craftworker's entrance, dressed in the plain leather of a journeyman mason. He was good. He moved with the particular anonymity of someone trained to be overlooked. If Sarah had not spent 4 years in the craftworker's block, she might not have noticed him. She noticed him. She kept cutting. And she sent the image down the bond with the clarity of a detail you'd been trained to see. Calder's people intercepted the man in the lower yard. He was carrying a small glass vial of something Bodine identified as a mineral dissolver, designed, she said quietly, to break down bonding compounds. If it had made contact with Sarah's work, it might have damaged the root bond itself. Farron was removed from the council chamber that evening, calmly, efficiently, with a particular absence of drama that Calder brought to everything he actually meant. Sarah was in the stone-cutting yard when it happened. She was finishing a new piece, the largest she had attempted since arriving, a panel nearly 4 feet wide, white sandstone, carved with a pattern she had been planning in her head for 2 weeks. Not memorial work, not border patterns, something of her own. She worked through dinner. Calder brought food, set it on the low wall without comment, and returned to the stronghold without trying to redirect her, and she ate standing up without stopping except to switch chisels. And she thought that she had never known anyone who understood how to give a maker time without making the giving into a demand for gratitude. The panel took 5 days. When it was finished, she stood back and looked at it in the early morning light, and what she saw surprised her, not because it was unexpected, but because it was true. She had carved 2 figures, not literal, not a portrait, something more structural, 2 forms in the stone, their shapes not quite human, not quite wolf, interlocked the way 2 pieces of a fitted joint interlock, and between them, in the space where they met, she had carved a 3rd shape. Small, hardly more than the suggestion of a form. The beginning of something. She hadn't planned that. She stood looking at it for a long time. Then she pressed her palm flat against the surface the way she pressed her palm to stone in the quarry to feel the grain, and the warmth that rose from it was not mineral heat. It was the bond. All of it. Copper bright and moving. She brought Calder to the yard that afternoon. He stood in front of the panel without speaking. His hand found hers. "What does the third shape mean?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said. "I carved it before I understood it." He looked at the panel for a long time. Then he looked at her. The amber in his eyes was quiet, deep. "When did you realize?" he said. She thought about it honestly. 3 days ago. But I hadn't let myself call it that yet. He turned to face her fully. "And now? And now I'm calling it that." He pulled her in, and she went, and the bond between them rang through every connection the compound had made, every seal, every line of copper light she had laid down in those first desperate minutes on the floor of a shed while the world outside came apart. She had made him strong enough to survive. She had not known she was making something else entirely. She knew now. The formal recognition came 2 weeks later. Not a grand ceremony, because Calder did not do things in the way of performance. He brought her before the council and his ranking warriors in the morning, in the stone-floored great hall with its good granite walls and high windows. And he placed her hand in the crook of his arm and told them plainly that Sarah was his bonded mate, confirmed by root bond and by his word, and that any question of rank, lineage, or pack assessment was superseded by a fact that predated the ranking system and would outlast it. One of the council members, the new one, Farron's replacement, a young female alpha named Des, who had been visibly trying to form an opinion about Sarah since she arrived, said carefully, "My lord, the Silver Compact will know within a week." "Yes," Calder said, "they will. And the Stone Singer lineage being active again will be dealt with," Calder said, "from a position of strength, which is the only position I've ever dealt with anything from." Des looked at Sarah. "Assessing." Sarah met her eyes and let herself be assessed, the way she let stone be examined. She knew what it was made of. "What can you do?" Des asked. Not hostile. Genuinely curious. Beyond the bonding compound. What else? Sarah thought about the panel in the yard. The lines of copper light. The third figure she'd carved before she understood why. "I don't know yet," she said. "I'm still finding out." Des nodded slowly. It was not entirely approval, but it was something that could become it. The Compact sent representatives 3 weeks later. They were not crude about it. They sent a formal envoy, politically protected, requesting an audience on the matter of craft bonding regulation. Calder received them in the great hall with Sarah at his side and Bodine and Des and his senior commanders ranged behind them, and the panels Sarah had carved installed on the wall behind the Lord's seat, where the light from the high windows caught it every hour differently, and the carved forms glowed with the warmth they'd held since the day she finished them. The envoy was a slight, careful man who said very reasonable things about tradition and order and the risks of unsanctioned bonding, and Sarah listened to him and recognized, underneath the reasonable language, the same structure as Lady Marsh's too large clothes and Dorvale's brisk assessment, and every moment in her life someone had tried to make her smaller, by making it seem obvious that small was what she was. When he finished, she said, "You destroyed the lineages because you were afraid of something you couldn't control. I understand that. Fear makes people precise in exactly the wrong direction." She kept her voice even. "But the lineage isn't destroyed. It's here, and it's bonded to the most powerful Alpha Lord in the Reaches. So whatever you came to regulate, I'd invite you to reconsider what that word means in the current context." The hall was very quiet. Calder did not speak. He did not need to. His hand rested on the arm of his seat with a stillness that communicated everything it needed to. The envoy left without an agreement, but without the escalation he had perhaps expected. It was not a victory. But it was a door held open rather than forced, and Sarah understood doors held open. She had spent years in rooms where she wasn't supposed to be, learning which entrances could be kept available if you handled them correctly. Lady Marsh came to the stone-cutting yard the evening after the envoy's visit. She came without announcement and stood at the entrance for a moment, looking at the work spread across the benches. Then she came in and walked the length of the yard slowly, the way she had walked through it the first time. That careful cataloguing attention. But she stopped differently this time. She stopped at the panel on the far wall. She looked at it for a long time. "You did this," she said. "Not a question." "Yes." Marsh reached out and touched the edge of the carved figures. Lightly. The way Sarah touched new stone, feeling the surface before committing to anything. Her hand stilled when she felt the warmth. "It's alive," Marsh said quietly. "In a way." Marsh was quiet. "Then, I sent you ill-fitting clothes to diminish you." "Yes, and you altered them and appeared at dinner and made it clear that you could not be diminished that way." "Yes." Another silence. Marsh turned from the panel and looked at Sarah with the first expression she'd worn, that had nothing behind it. No strategy, no calculation, no polished surface. Just a woman who had been wrong about something and was deciding what to do with that. "You're going to be very difficult to manage," Marsh said. "I'm not yours to manage," Sarah said. "Evenly." "No." Marsh almost smiled. "You're his, and I begin to think he knew that before either of you did." She paused at the yard entrance. "The clothes, I'll send better ones, properly fitted." A pause. "If you want them." Sarah thought about it. "Send the fabric," she said. "I'll fit them myself." Marsh left. The yard was quiet. The evening light came through the high opening at an angle that turned the white sandstone gold, and the carved figures on the panel threw long shadows toward the door. Spring came earlier than usual to the reaches. Meltwater ran through the carved channels of the lower grounds, and the mountain above the stronghold went from white to gray to the first patchy green as the snow retreated. Sarah's yard filled with new material she had ordered herself, speaking to suppliers directly, choosing her own pieces, handling her own contracts. She trained 2 young craft workers, both from the labor rotation. Both told all their lives that their wolves were weak, their skills marginal, their prospects contained. She did not tell them what she suspected about their lineages. She showed them, instead, how to read stone, how to find the direction it wanted to go. Calder wore no particular symbol of the bond. He didn't need one. The Reachers felt it. Something in the quality of how he led had changed in the specific way that things change when someone who has been making decisions alone for a very long time discovers they don't have to. On a morning in late spring, Sarah was at the bench with a new piece. Pale limestone, different from her usual granite and sandstone, with the grain she was still learning. She heard his heartbeat before she heard anything else, the steady, familiar rhythm that the bond had made as natural to her as her own. He stood in the doorway and watched her work. She set down the chisel and turned. "I want to show you something," she said. He crossed the yard and stood behind her, and she took his hand and placed it flat against the limestone, against the shape she had been roughing out for 3 days. Not a panel this time, not a formal piece. Something small, practical. A hollow carved into the stone the size of a palm, with a fitted lid she was still shaping. A reliquary. The kind of thing made to hold something precious and small and ongoing. "I haven't told you yet," she said. He went very still. "The bond changed when I realized," she said. "You felt it. I know you felt it." His fingers spread flat against the stone, against the carved hollow, against the shape that was unmistakably made for something coming. "How long?" he said. "I've known for certain about 2 weeks. He turned to face her. His eyes were amber and very bright. His other hand came up to her face, and against her cheekbone his touch was not the grip of an alpha lord, but something more careful. As if she were new stone and he was learning the grain. "You carved it before you told me," he said, and there was something almost wondering in his voice, underneath the alpha lord stillness. "Carving is how I understand things," she said. "I needed to carve it before I could say it." The morning light came through the high windows, and the bond sang between them, copper bright, root deep, made of mineral and blood, and the particular patience required to work with material that had its own direction and its own time. Outside the yard the mountain turned green, And somewhere in the lower grounds, one of her apprentices struck a chisel wrong and swore, and then struck it again correctly, and the sound of that, the small, ordinary sound of someone learning, rose up through the morning air into the place where Sarah stood with her hands chalked with stone dust, and her wolf fully awake, and her whole life altered past recognition by a vial of compound and a cut on her palm, and a man who had asked her name like he was, tasting something real. She pressed her palm to the carved hollow one more time, felt the warmth of the stone, felt the warmth of the bond, picked up her chisel and kept making.